Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us. Today, the Rockefeller Center is presenting the 2020 Perkins Bass Distinguished Lecture given by UNH President Emeritus Mark Huddleston. His topic will concern higher education, and we know that's something that is of tremendous interest to the Dartmouth community. So if you have questions or comments at any time during Dr. Huddleston's remarks, please avail yourselves of the chat and the Q&A buttons. We will have a question and answer part of tonight's event, and I'd like to introduce Shadi Mervarzan. Gosh, Shadi. Anyway, she will be facilitating our questions and answers today. It is my great pleasure to introduce the director of the Rockefeller Center, Jason Barabas. Thank you, Jason.
Hi, thank you, Joanne. Thank you. So it's a distinct pleasure. Hi, welcome. It's a distinct pleasure for the 2020 Perkins Bass Distinguished Lecturer to welcome Dr. Mark Huddleston, who served as the president of the University of New Hampshire from 2007 to 2018, which makes him the longest serving president in the history of UNH. Prior to his tenure at the University of New Hampshire, Dr. Huddleston served as the president of Ohio Wesleyan University, the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Delaware, and he was also a faculty member at the University at Buffalo, where he also received his BA degree. His MA and PhD degrees in political science are from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Over the course of his career, Professor Huddleston has provided consulting advice on a range of domestic and international organizations, including the World Bank and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Finally, Mark Huddleston has published extensively in the field of public administration with books, book chapters, and articles on civil service, including a book in 1996 titled Higher Civil Service in the United States. He also has published in Political Science Quarterly, the Policy Studies Journal, and many other outlets. At a time when the conduct of government workers is under increasing scrutiny, Dr. Huddleston brings a decade's worth of experience in the field as well as in the administration of higher education. So with that, we welcome Dr. Mark Huddleston. The title of his talk is Higher Education in America, an Existential Crisis. Thank you.
Well, Jason, thank you very much. I'm delighted to join you, and I want to thank you and Bob and Joanne and Laura and Shouty and everyone else at the Rockefeller Center for making this opportunity available to me. I'm always eager to talk about higher education, and it's
Mark,
yeah.
I'm sorry, can we jump in? We need you to turn your camera back on.
Aha.
Great. There we go.
Did that
Perfect.
work?
That's perfect.
All right. Well, did you hear what I said anyway?
Yes, we did.
Good. All right. Well, I left off saying I think I'm always happy to talk about higher ed. I'm eager, in fact, and it's especially gratifying for me to be able to do that in this Rockefeller Center venue. I grew up in central New York in the 50s and 60s in a family that had never seen anyone go to college. And I had the opportunity to change that and really to alter the trajectory of my life because of your namesake, Nelson Rockefeller. Rocky was effectively the father of the State University of New York system, and I very much doubt that I would have had the life I've had, or certainly had the lifelong love affair that I've had with higher education, had Governor Rockefeller not created so many opportunities for many young New Yorkers like me. Now, given the title of this talk and the fact that we're all on Zoom together, you're probably assuming that it is about the impact of the pandemic on higher education. It's true that COVID-19 has battered most colleges and universities. Those that are trying to remain open are struggling with testing, negotiating student behavior with local communities, and maintaining social distancing in facilities that were designed for anything but distancing. Those that have gone the virtual route are likely experiencing even greater financial hardships. Students and families are balking at paying full tuition for what they regard as less than full educational experiences. Dorms and dining halls sitting empty aren't generating the revenues necessary to pay the debt service that allowed them to be built in the first place. And comprehensive student fees used to offset athletic budgets and student affairs programs have evaporated. Although no one can do a full accounting at this still early point, I think the toll is going to be huge. The heads of the major higher ed lobbying groups made a pitch to Congress earlier this week in Washington asking for $120 billion in COVID relief funds. And it probably won't be sufficient. But the pandemic and its baleful effects are really not the reasons for my talk. Instead, what I see as an existential crisis in U.S. higher education long predates COVID-19 and has in fact been decades in the making. And to expand on that, I'd like to make two arguments in this talk. The first, which is only mildly contentious, is that large numbers of U.S. colleges and universities are in deep, deep financial distress. I believe that over the next few years, certainly over the next decade, we will see a substantial reduction in the number and variety of colleges and universities in America. This assertion is at least mildly contentious because it seems to be contradicted by the evidence of our own eyes. COVID notwithstanding, there are still lovely campuses all across the country. There are students walking across the quads and faculty sitting in the library doing research and even football games in some places on the weekend. Moreover, one might take exception to an assertion about higher ed's financial fragility because academia has never been short of Cassandras. I Googled higher education crisis, as one does, preparing this talk, and not surprisingly got 587,000 hits, which I did not read all of, ranging from the student debt crisis and mental health crisis to the leadership crisis, the humanities crisis, and many, many others beside. So it's tempting to dismiss a warning like mine as more of the same. But I think things really are different now. The wolf is actually at the door, the sky really is falling, and the first thing I'll do is try to offer some evidence of that. The second argument that I'll make, which is more contentious and maybe even a little bit contrary sounding, is that financial rescue, or some version of it, is probably not too far around the corner. In fact, policy circles in Washington and in state capitals, on the left and on the right, are awash in ideas about how to, quote unquote, fix higher education. The problem, at least from my perspective, is that these fixes will, in terms of higher ed's existential crisis, simply finish off what the financial stressors started. For me, as a lover of academe, that's a bleak picture. For generations, America has had a system, a term I use advisedly as it's really more of a non-system, of higher education that has been the envy of the world. We have over 4,000 colleges and universities in this country, with astonishing variety among those institutions. Some are huge, many are tiny. In fact, 40% of all colleges have fewer than 1,000 students. Most are secular, but some have serious religious affiliations and missions. We have HBCUs and majority and minority institutions. We have land-grant institutions. We have research institutions and teaching-oriented liberal arts colleges. 35% of all American students attend two-year colleges, most in pursuit of a vocationally oriented associate's degree. And this is a system, or non-system again, that has historically afforded students and their families unparalleled choice. It has afforded faculty, individually and collectively, almost complete autonomy over what is taught and how it is taught. It has afforded many small communities anchors of employment and culture. It has afforded the nation its single greatest source of productivity driving innovation. To see that system imperiled is worrisome, to say the least. Now, I will say that there are more than a few higher ed commentators out there who would disagree. They would say, you're right, meaning me, I'm right, that vast changes are in store, but that's a good thing. Your view, my view, of higher education is probably romantic. As a nation, we are in desperate need of overhauling an antiquated, opaque, overpriced, ineffective, and unaccountable system of post-secondary institutions. That's an important perspective, and I'll return to it before we conclude. Wrestling with it really is at the heart of my second argument. But first, let me run through the less contentious, less provocative contention, namely that most colleges and universities really are seriously cash-strapped. It's actually less easy to substantiate than one might think. First, university finances are really, really opaque. some would say deliberately opaque. Trying to figure out something as straightforward as the cost of operating an athletic program, for instance, is headache-inducing and probably ultimately fruitless. Second, since there is no agreed upon definition of what higher ed's product is, or products are, most important student, it's hard to garner agreement on when an institution has begun to fail. Those difficulties aside, I think it's actually pretty clear that most institutions don't have enough money to meet their missions. They don't have the money to pay the faculty and staff they need to teach and support students. They don't have enough money to keep up library acquisitions or to stay on top of IT needs. They don't have enough money to keep up with basic maintenance of infrastructure, much less invest in new classrooms and laboratories. I can certainly attest that in my 14 years as a college president, every year was tougher than the year before. Expenses rose relentlessly, revenues got harder to find, enrollment targets became more difficult to meet, state appropriations got more meager, budget cuts and hiring freezes more regular. My experiences, I think, mirrored national trends. Although federal funds, depending on how one counts, have either remained steady or increased slightly over the last decade, there have been significant state disinvestments in higher education, particularly since the Great Recession. According to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, 45 states spent less per student on higher education in 2018 than they did in 2008. 45 states. Partly as a result, but also reflecting other underlying dynamics, tuition has risen sharply, far in excess of base rates of inflation. As recently as the early 1980s, college costs were such that an average student attending an average college could get a summer job, work for 26 hours a week for 3 months in a minimum wage job, and have enough money to pay basic expenses for the year. Today, the same student working the same minimum wage job and receiving the same financial aid package would have to work 21 hours a day for 3 months to pay for the same expenses. College has simply become a less affordable option for average families, even as it has become more financially challenging for the institutions. One statistic I find especially troubling is that, according to the Institute for Higher Education Policy, only 6 flagship public universities in the country can be considered affordable for most lower and middle income students. Sadly, New Hampshire, with UNH, is not one of them. Student debt has risen in line with these escalating costs. It is now in aggregate over $1.5 trillion in the United States. But from an institution's perspective, there are hard ceilings on revenue, even on debt-financed tuition. Students and families have become canny bargainers. Tuition discounting, which is the amount given back in financial aid, often merit aid, from the sticker price of tuition, has risen to record levels, around 25% on average, according to NACUBO, which is the National Association of College and University Business Officers. While this is not particularly an issue for institutions that can replace tuition with other dollars, it is a crippling challenge for those that are tuition dependent. Now, aggravating all of this are demographic headwinds. Nationally, college enrollment has declined about 11% since its peak in 2010. That decline is projected to continue, even steepen, owing to the lower birth rates that the country has been experiencing. The Northeast and Midwest are particularly vulnerable on this count. So what does that all add up to? It adds up to a large number of cash-strapped institutions chasing a diminishing number of students who are demanding larger discounts to enroll, which of course makes the institutions even more cash-strapped. But we don't have to rely just on anecdotes and broad trends to make this case. All of the major bond rating agencies, for instance, have soured on higher education. Moody's has downgraded the sector from stable to negative. The S&P in May announced that 117 institutions would join 50 others already on their negative watch list. Fitch has been negative on the sector even before the pandemic. But the most granular, compelling, and evidence-based examination of the health of U.S. colleges and universities, at least for me, comes from a combination of a recent academic study out of Penn and an even more recent Hechinger report based on that study. The Penn study was produced by a friend of mine, actually, Bob Zemsky, a highly regarded professor of history and higher education at Penn, and two of his colleagues. Using a variety of sophisticated metrics, they created what they called a college stress test and published a book by earlier this. Their analysis suggests that while only 10% of institutions are in imminent danger of closing, another 30% will struggle, to use their term. They argue that the remaining 60% may actually strengthen at the expense of their faltering brethren. So maybe that's not so bad unless you're one of the bottom 40%. But then the Hechinger report took the Zemsky et al. Appendix and created what they called a financial fitness tracker, applying it to 2,300 individual schools and making the data transparent and public. Hechinger found that more than 500 institutions in their population of 2,300 had major fails on 2 of their 4 metrics: enrollment, tuition revenue, public funding, and endowment health. Over half of the institutions in their population had seen enrollment declines over the last decade, including 800 of the 4-year schools. A third of them brought in less net tuition revenue per FTE than they had 10 years ago. 700 of the public campuses received less in state and local money than they had a decade earlier, and almost 200 of the privates saw the value of their endowments fall relative to costs. And again, all of this was pre-COVID, so we can just imagine that's getting worse. Sorry. So, given this data, it is not surprising that we will see more actual closings. I would refer those of you who are interested, and maybe also who have a slightly ghoulish streak, to check out the Education Dive, which is essentially a college death watch site on the internet. It has recorded over 50 closures since 2010. That's the Education Dive. These closures do not, by the way, include consolidations, real or imagined, where institutions nominally continue to exist. Pennsylvania, for instance, is busy consolidating a lot of the colleges and universities in their system of higher education. Alaska's been going through this. Vermont, as those of you who live in the state may know, has been going through this. And on that note, I would point out that those of us who live in New England have had front row seats to this debacle, mainly because we have a historically high concentration of colleges and, at least in northern New England, chronic levels of underfunding. So our demographics are truly grisly. Our numbers in general are truly grisly. And just in the last 5 years, we've seen 5 closures in Vermont: Burlington College, Green Mountain, Southern Vermont, St. Joe's, Marlborough, and 1 in New Hampshire, the Institute of Art in Manchester. And I would be shocked if more weren't coming, although I don't want to talk about that right now. None of these data capture what may be an even worse fate than institutional death, though, which is kind of a zombie-like walking death where the institution nominally survives but is so hollowed out owing to consistent freezes, budget cuts, and belt tightenings that it becomes hard to describe it as a meaningful institution of higher education. In any event, the situation is unsustainable. Although we in academia tell ourselves all the time that we're not businesses, and we pride ourselves on not being businesses, the fact is that the books have ultimately got to balance. When revenues consistently don't meet expenditures, existence is inevitably threatened. I'm not sure, but I don't think that even zombies are immortal. Perhaps, and I emphasize perhaps, the good news is that this unsustainability is increasingly recognized in Washington, D.C., and in many state capitals. Even higher education's most obdurate critics know that the nation and its economy cannot survive without a large array of healthy post-secondary institutions. Which brings me to my second, maybe more contentious point. The most obvious examples of the increased attention to higher education have been the quote-unquote free college proposals championed first by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and ultimately taken up by most of the huge field of candidates in the Democratic primaries this year, wherein all public colleges and universities would be tuition-free, with some candidates suggesting means testing, others not. The Biden campaign has since embraced a modified version with 2-year community colleges made free for all comers and 4-year public colleges and universities made free for families with annual incomes less than $125,000 a year. Quite a few states have actually already cobbled together various free or near free systems. Various left-leaning with higher ed initiative. The Urban Institute, for instance, has published a very informative series of memos on data and transparency, accountability, workforce priorities, accreditation reform, and so forth. The Brookings Institution had an online event earlier this month on achieving accountability in higher education. The Third Way, another Washington think tank, published a major piece on what No Child Left Behind can teach us about how the feds should deal with higher education, especially in establishing accountability measures. Interestingly, many on the right have been pressing for similar reforms, which I put in air quotes. The American Enterprise Institute has published a slew of papers and reports on higher ed policy. Transparency, accountability, reform of accreditation have been high on the list of many Republican governors and senators for years. And various forms of performance-based funding are already in place in many red states. With this outbreak of apparent bipartisanship, which is a vanishingly rare phenomenon these days, it was thus not surprising that just before the pandemic hit, there was great optimism in Washington about an imminent breakthrough on the reauthorization of the Higher Ed Act of 1965. This is the basic piece of legislation that frames federal higher education policy. Perhaps most importantly, it includes Title IV, which is the covering legislation for all federal financial aid. The Higher Ed Act is supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years, but in fact it's been stalled since 2008. But last winter, committee staff sequestered themselves and apparently were about to deliver a bipartisan compromise under the guidance of Senator Lamar Alexander when COVID struck. But the essence of that compromise, reportedly anyway, was, and it probably will also be the shape of any future compromises, that more money will be made available to higher ed in exchange for more accountability. Maybe that's not a bad deal. Maybe you even think that greater federal control of higher education is a good idea. The public may deserve a say in how its money gets spent, one might aver. Moreover, there are a lot of weak and underperforming institutions out there. We know from the gainful employment battles with for-profit institutions during the Obama years, for instance, that there are a lot of bad actors out there all too happy to suck up taxpayers' Title IV money. Anyway, what's wrong, one might say, with more data transparency, a simplified FAFSA, and maybe even an enhanced college scorecard? Maybe nothing, but I would be wary. Today's data transparency can easily slide into tomorrow's cost controls, enrollment targets, and guidance on appropriate majors and skills at graduation. I personally have grave doubts that any trade of money for accountability will, in the long term, prove anything other than Faustian for higher education. Even if you think that sympathetic allies are the ones writing the standards today, there really is no guarantee that they will be the ones doing it tomorrow. As one conservative think tanker put it recently, the imposition of uniform federal standards in higher education will provide, and I quote, a target-rich environment. Smart, entrepreneurial GOP senators will have a field day targeting the bloat, sloth, and ideological bias that too often pass for academic culture, unquote. In fact, I would argue that higher education, at least as I understand it, and as I understand how it has operated for generations, doesn't have any friends in politics. Let me repeat that. I don't think higher education truly has any friends in politics. In my experience, elected officials from all sides, with few exceptions, have only a superficial understanding of what colleges and universities do, why they exist, and how they operate. Higher education is for them an opportunity to advance their own agendas, and the incentives for political overreach are powerful. So that's the nub of my anxiety. Those colleges and universities that don't expire, first from revenue starvation, are going soon to feel intense pressure to meet a growing list of federal standards, threatening the autonomy, diversity, and strength of our non-system of higher education, one that has been the envy of the world for generations. And that is an existential crisis. Thank you very much. I apologize for the noise in the background, which took me a minute to silence.
Thank you, Mark. I believe I'm on camera now, and if so, that's great. We really appreciate these remarks, especially getting started with a new academic term here ourselves. Very provocative, very informative. And I want to also, I'm going to ask a question, but during this time, I want to also invite the audience to start asking questions in a Q&A or a chat feature, and then Shouty, our student, will review those and forward those to you after I get a chance to ask a question. I was struck by your remarks when you were talking about two things. First of all, that there's perhaps bipartisan agreement prior to COVID on the financial rescue, or that there would be hope or optimism. But at the same time, you also mentioned, and it was very, very poignant, that higher education has no friends in politics. And that seemed to imply sort of bipartisan, ignoring the higher education system. As you mentioned, the SUNY system at the outset. So I came to Dartmouth from Stony Brook on Long Island. So I'm also a beneficiary of Nelson Rockefeller's vision when it comes to higher education and the expansion, just like the University of Buffalo. I've seen examples of governors who have really poured a lot into higher education, and I've also seen, by being a faculty member in the 2010s, 2020s, that dollars from Albany are certainly hard to find nowadays. I'm also seeing, though, perhaps in the electorate or in the population itself, big partisan divides on the value of education, right? So I'm just noticing a Pew report from 2018, big gaps between Democrats and Republicans on the value of higher education, in particular concerns about, a 60-point gap on whether or not professors are bringing political views into the classroom. So I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this supposed bipartisan consensus on funding higher education, yet no real understanding or no real financial support in the modern era for universities.
Sure. Just to restate what I think my basic point is, I think that there is a growing bipartisan consensus that we need to figure out how to provide more assistance, if not directly to institutions, at least to students who need to attend institutions of higher education. So I would imagine that Pell Grants, for instance, will be augmented in the future. But I think that both on the right and the left, there will be an expectation that in return for that, higher education needs to be sorted out. And what that sorting out looks like will vary a little bit from one side to another. But I think there is a lot of commonality around buzzwords like accountability and transparency and credit portability and a variety of other things that are not in themselves all that fearsome and worrisome, I think, from higher ed's perspective. But based at least on my experience with politicians, I think it's a pretty short step from there to other kinds of what I would regard as intrusions into the business of colleges and universities that will really threaten the character of what we've come to understand as autonomous institutions of higher education. You're absolutely right. And I mean, I started out my talk talking about Nelson Rockefeller. There certainly are folks in politics and elective office historically, and to some extent contemporaneously, who have been supportive of higher education. But I think, at least in my experience, I can count the number on a few fingers of one hand who have genuinely backed off in demands of trying to shape what we do, as opposed to saying, boy, you folks are really valuable. You do wonderful things for our young people and for our economy and for the nation as a whole. We need to support you. Take this money and go do what you do best. Instead, what I've experienced increasingly is a set of demands that we comport ourselves in ways that accord with those politicians' agendas. And I don't think that the content of those demands may differ from left and right, but the insistency of the demands I have not found to differ a great deal. I'll call out one exception. And actually, exceptions sometimes prove the rule. But one of your own colleagues now at Dartmouth, John Lynch, was a wonderful exemplar of what I think an elected official should be like with respect to higher education. I mean, John, before he was governor, was chair of the board of the university system. He read work and appreciation for what it did for the state and for the country more generally. And as governor, he was as supportive as any New Hampshire governor can be, which is not really all that supportive. But he never, ever interfered in the business of the university. I never got a call from John Lynch when I was president to say anything other than, hi, how's it going? How can I be helpful? That is not a statement I can make about probably any other politician I've ever worked with. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
No, I think it's helpful, and I hope John Lynch is watching. He I know lectures at Tuck a number of times, and we're trying to work with some of the Tuck folks as well to get him involved in Rocky programming.
Well, hi, John. You are watching.
Okay, so thank you. I guess at this point I want to turn it over to the audience. I noticed several questions queuing up in the chat. So with that, I'm going to transfer my screen over to Shouties and let her ask the rest of the questions. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Jason.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to our audience we already have so many great questions. So we'll just get started with what we have here. So first question is, assuming a range of quality and responsibility for institutions, how does one decide which should be saved and which are simply not worth it or deserving?
As in which institutions are not worth? Yeah. Well, that's certainly a tough one. And I think that as what I call the non-system has operated, it's largely been a set of market forces. And at least with respect to the system writ large. I think that increasingly, though, as financial pressures arise, with respect to public institutions in particular, governing boards are being put in very difficult positions to make those decisions. I'll give you an example from Vermont. Currently, the state has been wrestling with how to keep open, operate in the face of really declining enrollments, in the face of a declining demographic, all of the state colleges. And they know that to amalgamate them in any way may make some kind of sense. In fact, that was recommended by the former chancellor before he was fired for making this recommendation. But it has devastating effects on local communities when you do that. And I don't think there are any formulas, especially in the public sector. It is a tremendously political process, and we as a nation, I think, are going to see a lot more of it, especially here in the Northeast, as other states around us wrestle with an overbuilt system. And I don't envy the people having to make that decision. I don't have a set of metrics. I really don't. And with respect to private institutions, ultimately it boils down to what those institutions can plot for themselves as a future, and they can carve out a niche that is viable in the marketplace. If they have sufficient supportive alumni who can backfill tuition revenues, but there really is no magic set of metrics, I don't think, to make those decisions.
Great, thank you. Similarly, another question from Frank. The Harvards and Dartmouths of the world have tremendous endowments. However, smaller colleges do not. Based on your comments, what do these colleges do to survive?
Yeah, well, they would be happy, I'm sure, to accept some help from Harvard or Dartmouth. Joking aside, I don't know. I mean, everyone is now out there strenuously fundraising, but few institutions have the deep history that Dartmouth and Harvard do of being in that game. And we certainly undertook it at the University of New Hampshire when I was there as seriously as we could. But it's a really, really hard thing to do. It takes a long time to build that infrastructure. It takes a long time to educate alumni as to their responsibility to give back to their alma maters. It's not a quick fix for anyone. And I think ultimately most institutions are going to have to look beyond private fundraising for their salvation. I had I can probably look up the statistics, but the number of institutions that have, of those 4,000 that I mentioned, any sort of meaningful endowment is infinitesimal. I think the average, not that in this context, but I think the average endowment is something like $7.3 million across all of those, which, if you do the math, produces annual spin-offs on that investment of next to nothing. You really can't do anything with that. So I think that's just not an avenue that is going to be helpful to most institutions. Now, you probably know that some in Washington have thought that it would be a good idea, looking at Harvard's endowment and Dartmouth's endowment and Stanford's endowment and others, to tax those. And there is, in fact, now a tax on the endowments of nonprofits that is relatively small right now, but I expect that it's going to get larger. I actually testified before Congress when that was first proposed against it. Despite the fact that we had a relatively small endowment, I thought it was going to have a really depressing effect on my ability to raise money if my donors thought that part of what they gave was going to be turned over in taxes. But my hunch is that, like a lot of taxes, that one is likely only to grow in the future. I think endowment envy is strong, and I think politicians are going to have a hard time keeping their fingers off those pots.
Thank you. Another question here. Looking particularly at state universities, it seems that they are state universities only due to the land and physical plans they occupy, as state legislatures continue to defund them. Are there more creative ways that state universities can generate revenues through novel uses of their land and buildings to offset revenue losses from the states?
Yeah, I used to joke that we went from being a public university to, or a state university, to a state-supported university, to a state-located university, and ultimately to a state-abused university. But the legislature didn't laugh much at that joke. I do think that it is possible to monetize some of the assets of not just state universities, but really all universities, and some of them have gotten quite adept at it. Many look around and see empty buildings during the summer and figure if they're in an attractive area with tourists around, they can turn their facilities into kind of a summer camp or a place to host visitors. Others have looked to essentially beyond the traditional student body and trying to use their facilities to entice adults for continuing education or other kinds of uses. And I think absolutely one can do that. It can get a little bit tricky. I remember, I think it was right on the heels of the Great Recession when our budget was really taking a beating. I had conversations with some developers who were interested in a partnership where we would use some university land to co-develop that land for some retail purposes and professional purposes, and we'd be able to use some of those revenues to support construction of some new facilities at the university. And that proposal ran into a buzzsaw very quickly. There are a lot of constituencies that don't want to see the university change materially in those kinds of ways, even if you kind of argue it's a survival necessity. Change comes with some difficulty in university communities. So it's a good idea, but not always easy to implement.
We have another question, kind of asking if we can involve some discussion with the Choices in Education Act, specifically the 2017 proposed amendments. Do you have anything to say about that?
I'm not, is that a K through 12? I don't know that act, actually. So maybe you can enlighten me, or the questioner can enlighten me.
Yeah, if the person who asked the question would like to specify further, that'd be great. Then we'll just move to a different question. Are the financial problems facing U.S. post-secondary institutions mirrored in other countries?
To greater or lesser extents, yes. The problems are pretty universal in the sense that the basic drivers of the cost issue in the U.S. are present pretty much anywhere there are labor-intensive enterprises like colleges and universities. I think we're experiencing it a little bit sooner or a little bit more sharply because we have we compared to other OECD countries, our neighbors in Western Europe and in Japan and so forth, have a greater aversion to public spending for higher education, and therefore the crunches come to us first. But I think sooner or later, other countries will feel it too. And Britain has been struggling with this for years too, and various British governments have tried increasing fees and importing more foreign students and engaging in performance-based funding and so forth. So really, it's not just an American problem, but I do think we're probably the canaries in the coal mine to some extent.
All right, our next question is something I think a lot of students and parents are probably wondering. For a number of years, there's been a call for institutions to justify what they provide is worth the price. Is there a way for colleges and institutions to prove that what they provide is worth public support?
Great question. And I think about that question in two different ways. First, if there were and this is what I worry about and what I was trying to say in the second part of my talk, I worry that it is exactly that concern that will drive a lot of forthcoming federal metrics. I mean, the college scorecard, which the Obama administration broached and really didn't go very far, but I think will probably be the centerpiece of a revival effort later on, is an example of that. It's if you think about U.S. News and World Report and their rankings, those are almost all input-oriented things, where you look at how much colleges are spending on student-faculty ratios and how many books are in their library and stuff. The question your questioner asked really is about outputs, and the college scorecard was an effort to look at outputs. What's the graduation rate? What are kids getting paid when they graduate? All that kind of stuff. I think it's a really good idea for colleges and universities on their own to do that, and I always made it a central part of my efforts as president to make that case when I talk to prospective parents or to alumni about what UNH would do for them and what kind of evidence I could adduce to show what UNH would do for them. But it's, in my mind, very different for the higher ed community to get smart about that and to talk about that than it is for the federal government to impose a set of standards to do that. I'd much rather see the former than the latter, because I think the latter likely will not be very effective and will come back to bite us.
Great. So next question. Do you think institutions of higher education are responsible for students' well-being, specifically amidst unique circumstances, such as COVID, or is the academy meant simply for thought and communal/instructional discussion?
Wow, that is a great question. And when I first got to college back in 1968, it was at the very end of what was called in loco parentis years, the time when colleges explicitly had a responsibility for the welfare and morality of their students. There were parietal hours, and men couldn't be in women's dorm rooms or vice versa, or even in the same dormitories. And there was almost a suffocating sense of college responsibility for student lives. And around that time, in the mid to late 60s, all that began to fall by the wayside. And we being the higher ed community, rejected that in loco parentis idea that colleges were somehow responsible. I have long thought, long being for the last 15 or 20 years, that we have slipped back into a kind of in loco parentis mode without really thinking about it very consciously. For good or ill, it is a fact that most colleges now accept responsibility for the physical health of their students, for the mental health of their students, for the safety and security of their students, and so on and so on and so on. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe not. I would like it, though, if we were a little more conscious about how we made those decisions, I think it would be helpful if we had a more open dialogue about that and where those responsibilities really ought to lie. But it's a great question.
That's a great point. So our next question notes that some universities seem to be thriving, bringing in an example of Arizona State University under the leadership of Michael Crow and his New American University model that reconstitutes the way universities are organized, no more traditional departments, and instead more transdisciplinary approaches. So are the traditional silos of higher education kind of part of the problem? Or at this point, would any change in curricula for troubled colleges and universities be simply rearranging the deck chairs of the Titanic?
Well, I'm a great fan of Michael Crow, and I think he has done some phenomenal things at Arizona State. And I'm also consonant with that. I'm a great fan of experimentation and of kind of letting 1,000 flowers bloom and having different institutions try different things. I think that's one of the beauties of the American non-system, as I called it, that we have the opportunity for that to happen because there really is no straitjacket that all institutions are put into. And I think that will pay dividends. I think that we are stumbling our way toward probably some smarter ways of doing what we do, and they're not all going to look alike. Some will suit the needs of some students better. Some will suit the needs of some regions better, and that's great. By the same token, I wish I could say that I'm really optimistic that all that experimentation, innovation, ultimately will lead to a rescue of many of the imperiled colleges and universities we have today. I'm not sure we've got the time to play that string out and see how all those experiments work, although I'm still a fan of doing that. And when I was at UNH and Ohio Wesleyan, I tried to encourage faculty and staff to, it's a terrible cliche, but to think outside that proverbial box, think about new ways of doing things, and without sacrificing the beauty and wonder of what higher education is all about.
Thank you. Our next question is, how do you feel about the state of endowments if a school is merged? I know that many Marlboro alumni wanted their contributions returned when Marlboro was merged with Emerson. Is it fair that the endowment is transferred to when the missions of the two colleges are so different?
Man, that is when I would turn over to the lawyers. There is a whole legal specialty in what happens to endowments when circumstances change. I don't know. I don't know how you'd give them back anyway. In any meaningful way. Most endowments are from folks who have long departed the scene, and it would be very difficult to track down heirs and try to give that money back in a meaningful way. I understand the anger and frustration of alumni from institutions that, or benefactors otherwise, of institutions that have merged or closed, but boy, there is no easy way around that. And sadly, we will see more of it. There's no getting around it. One of the most sensitive questions, I think, actually, and the Marlboro one makes me think of it in higher ed these days, is how much transparency about the financial peril of particular institutions is appropriate. There's another outfit out there. I think they're based in Boston. They started out as, maybe they still are, a kind of advising firm for parents and kids who wanted to find out more about their college choices. But they put out a website doing what a lot of other people haven't done, which is to name names about who's on the brink, who's about to fold. And it was very controversial because, well, I mean, as soon as you drop that one drop of blood in the water and indicate that an institution is bleeding, is wounded, it will cause a panic, like a run on the banks, and arguably hasten the demise of that institution. By the same token, is it fair to prospective students and parents to let them invest in an institution that may not be there by the time they are supposed to graduate? Hard to say. That's a really tough question, and your Marlboro alumnus has got a point on his or her hand.
Great. So this is going to be our last question for today. Thank you to everyone who submitted all these great questions. So our last question is, how substantial will the impact of a decreasing number of international students attending U.S. colleges be?
Huge, huge. One of the things that I did when I was at UNH in an effort to diversify our revenues was to expand our international recruitment. When I got there, again, I used to joke that the only international students we had were very few in number, and they all carried hockey sticks from Canada. And we needed to expand our international students, both because we needed that revenue stream, but also just to diversify the campus and make it a more interesting and lively place. When I was at Ohio Wesleyan, 10% of our students were international students, and it was wonderful. But having said that, I'm kind of glad for UNH that we didn't get so successful in that endeavor that we became truly reliant on it. I think a number of institutions in the last decade or so became truly reliant on that drip feed from international enrollment, and they are in deep, deep trouble now because, as we know, with the current administration and clampdowns on visas and on immigration in general, it's been really difficult for foreign students to come. In China is just a case study in itself. The largest chunk of international students, and now it's the most difficult group really to have come to the States. So that's a really tough one. And a sad day for the U.S. when we lose that edge and lose that attractiveness to the international community.
Well, thank you, Shadi. Thank you, Dr. Huddleston. That was provocative and certainly given us a lot to think about. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. I want to thank everyone who also shared their days with us. We appreciate you attending. If you want to make sure that you don't miss any of our events, feel free to email the Rockefeller Center and we'll put you on our e-news so you don't miss any of our events, including next week's, which is going to be called After George Floyd, Policing, Racism, and Criminal Justice Reform. It's a panel discussion. We'll have Professors Frank Baumgartner, Andra Gillespie, and Philip Adebagoff. We will be hosted once again by Jason Barbas, and Professor Herschel Naklis will be doing the moderating of the panel discussion. So thank you all for attending. We hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.